Thank you, and good evening. The part about the travel is true. My wife, Carol, is sitting right here, and she would probably tell you we have been married. She would tell you we've been married for more than 35 years, but we've been together for maybe 20. She's thinking 10. The part that wasn't true is about being a national leader. That is not on my resume. The rest of it is, but thank you very much. I started my career, the only way I was able to squeeze all that in was that I started in black and white TV. Speaking of color, by the way, I see some people are not wearing green. You do not know that, once again, St. Patrick's Day is not just a holiday for the Irish, it's a nationwide holiday because for the first time since the days of the Kennedy administration, we have an Irishman in the White House, President Obama. For those who came to hear the ambassador from Afghanistan, and I hope in the future you'll get a chance to, I want to say genuinely, I'm not sorry that I'm not him. I don't want his job, and I'm glad I'm not from Afghanistan, but I'm sorry that you don't get to hear him. As Randy said, and as Joe said before that, we've tried a few times in the past. I haven't been able to make it. I've had to cancel at the last minute. Very simple story. I still travel a lot. For the last 5 years, and this is pertinent to what I'm going to talk about, I've been a correspondent for a program called World Report, which is probably appealing to anybody who would come to the World Affairs Council, on an all-high-definition network called HDNet. That's where Dan Rather also now lives. And we do a weekly, freshly produced documentary-style program. And if you're a journalist, it's a dream job. But I travel a lot, and in fact, almost had to cancel tonight because amongst other things I get to, and I say get to because it's a privilege, cover the space program. I've been at every shuttle launch. I actually anchor an hour-long program, sometimes longer, from Kennedy Space Center around every launch, so I was there Sunday night. But I made 2 trips to Florida, just this, Carol's now thinking maybe 8 years is more accurate. Just this last week, because they first wanted to launch Space Shuttle Discovery on February 12th, and then they found, as some of you might have noticed, a problem with a flow valve in the hydrogen part of the fuel tank. And so they canceled, and they had to figure out how to fix the problem. And then they tried to launch, I think it was Wednesday that we were there, and they scrubbed just a few hours before the scheduled launch with another problem with the hydrogen part of the tank. This was a vent line, so flammable problem. They had to figure it out. And they finally launched Sunday night. Third time was the charm, and third time, I think, is the charm for me to be able to be here tonight as well. So that story has a happy ending, but when Randy called me, I think back in probably September or October, I think it was October because I had just come back from shooting a program and reporting from Lebanon. And so I was mindful of the fact that not every story has a happy ending. Obviously, to stand here before you and say that is to run counter to the natural instinct that I think all of us have in human nature, that not every story ends happily, but it's absolutely true. In the time remaining, oh, that's it. So thank you very, very much. No, I'm going to take you to 4 places around the world and tell you a little about the lives of people in these 4 places. And I've deliberately chosen disparate places, but all of which are places 3 out of the 4 I've been to in the last 5 or 6 months. One of them just a little longer back. But they are Russia, South Africa, Vietnam, and Lebanon. And we'll start with Russia, because no matter what century they've been in, no matter who has ruled them politically, no matter what shifts have arisen in the world outside their borders or what shifts have taken place in the sort of mysterious atmosphere inside their borders, the Russians have always lived with adversity, and they still do. And that underlines the difference between them and us. You know, they've had political tyrants, and they've had economic hardships, and they have harsh weather half the year, every year since the beginning of time. And the difference is that their release from these challenges is only by small degrees and usually only temporary. We're idealists in this country, probably more the idealists than anyone else on earth. And if we face a challenge, we welcome it, we overcome it, we revel in our ability to overcome adversity. The Russians, and this is a generalization, certainly doesn't apply to everybody, they have low expectations. because they've never had reason to have high expectations with all of those challenges that they face, some of them natural, some of them political. So they've had low expectations, and the way they've learned to handle it is survive despite it, adapt to it. And maybe the best metaphor, I was just there, I just came back the beginning of this month from a trip to Russia. I used to go in and out when it was the Soviet Union. I did a documentary there about a year ago for this network, HDNet, about the politics. I went this time to talk about the space program. I mean, I do a lot of things, but the space program's one of them. And we went to the headquarters of the Russian space program. And so the metaphor I'm going to use to characterize the Russian people and how they just adapt to adversity is snow. We went to a place called Star City. It's their Johnson Space Center. The Johnson Space Center for NASA is where the astronauts train, where all the high-tech stuff happens. And then headquarters is Washington, and then the launch is in Florida. But this is their Johnson Space Center, Star City. It's deep in a birch forest, about an hour outside of Moscow. And it's there because in the earlier days of both space programs, they wanted to bury in secrecy where they operated and what they did there. And the Russians, of course, took that even more seriously than we did, because they didn't have any sense of public exposure for the program. And given where it is in this birch forest, it snows like crazy there. So when you're inside what I'll call the campus of Star City, which is acres and acres and acres, I mean, a lot of people live on it and work on it, and they have a lot of high-tech contraptions. They've got the world's biggest centrifuge. They've got a huge pool in which they have a mock-up of almost the whole International Space Station, into which the astronauts are then submerged, and cosmonauts who train there to practice their repair and maintenance techniques. And yet the roads are so deep in snow that they never plow, that your wheels will sink half a foot into the ruts, like you're in some remote country village in the middle of, I don't want to insult anybody here. I won't name a state, but you know who you are. If you're walking from a road to a building, the only path you have available, so you're not stepping in deep snow, is whatever your predecessors on that path have kind of trod down, like when you're walking through a forest and you say, well, this is good, it's kind of flattened down because somebody was here before us. That's all they do. You get on the steps, and every building has steps up to it. There are huge, treacherous clumps of ice that you have to navigate to get inside this building, which represents part of the birth of Russia's proudest modern achievement, the space program. It's pretty remarkable. So that's why my metaphor for the difference between the Russians and us and how they adapt where we overcome is simply snow. They don't try to mitigate the inconvenience. They don't try to mitigate the discomfort. They just get used to it and live with it. And then you start to apply that at higher levels that reach up into the political realm and the realm of foreign relations. And if I'm right, you can begin to understand part of the difference between them and us. Now, I've been in Moscow plenty of times, dating back many years. But what struck me about the snow in Star City was the fact that it was happening there. They got to space before we did. They put a man in space before we did. In case you don't know, and I remembered learning this a long time ago, but had forgotten until somebody told me there a couple of weeks ago, the word Sputnik means satellite. Every Russian satellite is Sputnik. Sputnik changed the world, changed the superpower relationship. That's how good they were. And to a degree, that's how good they are. Another difference, of course, between them and us is that we enjoy, every one of us in our lives, the spin-offs of the American space program. I'm kind of a homeboy for the space program. I've gotten to know a lot about it. I know a lot of the people high up in the program. And I think that it delivers more benefits than cost. And I won't give you a long list, but it begins with microchips, down to the dustbuster. When we were going to the moon, and NASA went to private contractors and said, we're going to have to collect moon dust. Can you help us? And they went to Black & Decker, the company Black & Decker, and said, you make neat little contraptions. Can you help us? And they came up with something. And out of that came the dustbuster. Mind you, the dustbuster for NASA probably cost $12 million. Ours is $39.95. But still, polarized sunglasses came from one of the companies that makes sunglasses. NASA went and said, we need greater protection against the ultraviolet rays for our astronauts who are going to be out there on the moon, fully exposed. They came up with what is today the polarizing process for sunglasses. here's something else that defines the Russian culture. There was an old saying that you used to hear from the cynics, although they said it quietly because they had to be very careful about how they talk. And the saying was, we'll pretend to work, you pretend to pay us. And that's how it was. That generally defined service in just anywhere you went in the old Soviet Union. Well, I had a similar experience that illustrates the fact that old habits die hard. I got there on, I don't know what date it was, probably February 26th or something. And I was traveling alone. I was going to work with a Russian crew with whom I've worked before. It's just cheaper for my company than for a crew to fly over with me from Colorado. And so I was hauling with my luggage 2 big, huge cases. One was 75 pounds with 2 high-definition TV cameras. We want them to use our cameras, which have an American electronic standard. I arrived, but I couldn't go through the green channel. It's pretty, you're whipsawed when you get there. 3 long flights overnight and all the rest. I arrived the second night, midway through. And I really want to just get to a hotel because we're going to get out before sunrise and work. And, bless you. And that too is free, along with the speech. But I had to go into the red channel, and there were 7, count them, 7 uniformed customs officers standing there. Not a one of them turns to me, not a one of them looks at me, none of them greets me. I know a few words in Russian. You learn about 20 words in every language where you go. So I know how to say hello and good evening and help please and that sort of thing. Nothing. I was invisible, absolutely invisible. I had filled out the requisite 3 pages of 3 different forms to import the equipment I was bringing in, including the serial numbers of everything right down to extension cords. And the estimated value. They don't want you to sell the stuff while you're there, so they want to keep track of what you bring in and what you bring out. And I want to turn them in and get going, and I finally go up to one guy who just happens to be the closest one to me, and I got, as the kids say today, in his face, and he still ignored me. I mean, I said all the same things. I was as close to him as I am to this microphone, really, a foot away, and he ignores me. Finally, I went out into the baggage area, asked, does anybody here speak English? Got a Russian who spoke English, came in and helped me, and finally a woman is helping me. I had to refill these forms. I'm telling you, this is 10 or 15 minutes each, 3 different times. They won't take photocopies, and it has to be hand done. On one of them, I checked da, which means yes, instead of niet, which means no. Just I was tired, had to redo the whole bloody form because of it. She wouldn't accept it just, initialing something. So anyway, I finally do it all, and I give it to her. And when I tell you, she went through this thing faster than you could lift your pen. Circle, 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 gave it back to me, go. I mean, I could have written for serial numbers, it's all cocaine. She wasn't looking at it. You will pretend to work, you pretend to pay us. And that's an old habit. This woman was probably 50 or so she dates back to the days of the Soviet Union. And it's my guess, and I say this based on some experience there and in other places, that it takes a generation or 2 for that kind of thing to go away. The point is, she had a job to do, but she didn't really need to do her job. Carol, my wife, who's here, who's never come to hear me speak before, so I'm flattered, and I hope it's the best damn talk I ever give. She saw this whole thing in Russia before I did. Once when we lived in London or Paris, I'm not stupid, I know that we lived in both, I just don't remember which one we lived in when she came. She came, I was going for several weeks, and so we knew I was going to be there for several weeks in and around Moscow, and so she came for a week or 2 weeks. I was busy most of the time. She usually wandered around on her own. And before she left, she said something, and she's heard me quote her before. She said, "What exactly are we afraid of here?" This is during the Cold War. Because she saw the sense of malaise, she saw the sense of lethargy in the people there. And a nation cannot move, a nation cannot ascend without the cooperation of the people. And I don't mean active, conscious cooperation, but they have to work hard for the nation to make, to achieve what it wants to achieve. People showed, and to this day in some places, show little energy or initiative. And again, it's only a generalization. It certainly doesn't apply to all. And I don't want to suggest that the Russians are fundamentally different than we are. There are people in other parts of the world who don't have the same sense of hygiene that we have. There are obviously people who don't have the same appreciation of human life that we have. They're not like that, but it's a dichotomy. They're part of the Western world, and yet they're not fully in the Western world. And so, in a way, they're creating a world of their own. You watch Mr. Putin, his behavior, and he is still very much in charge. Nobody knows for sure, but it's pretty obvious to all the analysts, the think tank people, and the politicians. He's still very much in charge. And everything he does seems designed to create, or I should say, invigorate, renew a strong sense of nationalism. Nationalism in and of itself is not a bad thing. Nationalism is born of pride in your nation, maybe your nation's achievements today, maybe your nation's rich, proud past. And it might be pride in its empire, it might be pride in its innovation, but that's the thing about nationalism. We Americans are nationalistic for many, many good reasons, and so are the Russians. They've been through great times despite their adversity and despite their suffering. But today, the nationalism is directed toward restoring the good old glory of Russia, restoring the good old days when Russia, or in those days the Soviet Union, spoke and the world trembled. Those days aren't that long ago, and there are plenty in Russia, and I'm convinced it includes Mr. Putin, who would like those days to come again. After the Soviet Union fell, which was, early 90s? Democracy did truly flourish. For the first time, people freely selected their leaders at the local level, at the provincial, their states are provinces, their provinces are what we call states, level, and at the federal level. And the media flourished as well, and political parties flourished. There were more than 50. And then Mr. Putin came in and did not a perfect U-turn, but certainly began a fairly wide one. And today, from something like 50 political parties, they're down to about a dozen, and they all happen to be friendly to the Putin regime because he came up with rules that basically disqualify any other political parties. Governors are appointed, I think it is, by the president now, and then senators in the upper of the two houses of their parliament are appointed by the governors. The mayors of Moscow and St. Petersburg and a few other major cities are now appointed, not elected. That's all changed in just a few years, so it was a brief flourish of democracy. As for the media, suffice it to say that Putin has shut down enough companies he didn't like that he hasn't been asked, I'm told, a provocative, inquisitive question by a reporter for years. So there's not such a happy ending to the experiment with democracy. People have freedoms they never had before. I mean, the proof is that I've been there and talked with critics openly with a television camera rolling. That never would have happened before the fall of the Iron Curtain. I met a year ago, as a matter of fact, with the most outspoken critic in the Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament, who is no longer there, by the way, because his party was, guess what, disqualified. But I asked him, how does Putin get away with all this stuff? I made note here of his answer, because this is how he answered. He said, Russians in the 90s had key problems, this is his language, had key problems. The economy fell down, incomes fell down. This is after the Soviet Union fell apart. Corruption grew up, many things were terrible, and the name for that was democracy. So their definition of democracy from experience is a little different than ours. One more thing, because I'm mindful of time. Another metaphor for the difference between us is, I'm obviously not sharp enough to come up with more sophisticated metaphors. I've used snow, now I'll use McDonald's. McDonald's came in the old days in Moscow, there was no place to go to eat. I mean, literally no place decent or healthy looking to go to eat. That's a bit of an exaggeration. There were a few, but precious few, and they cost precious treasure. These days, there are McDonald's there. But we generally, and I may misspeak on the behalf of some of you, but generally I think we see McDonald's as a convenience, sometimes a necessity. There they see it as a treat. So it would lead you to ask, what are these people thinking? You know, or maybe put differently, how is it that they think so differently than we do? I was in Indonesia in December, shooting a different program about water. And we went to a McDonald's, only once. It was about a 19-day trip. And we went to one McDonald's in a city called Palembang. It's not Jakarta, the capital. It's sort of a fancy city. Palembang. And everyone in there was dressed to the teeth Very rich, you could tell, because you can see that there's an upper class, a small middle class, and then everyone else is in the lower class. This was a very special, it's a foreign restaurant. It's sort of sophisticated. I mean, that's, so you say, well, okay, they think differently than we do. Some of it's nurture, some of it's nature. South Africa. The majority of blacks in South Africa, the majority of people in South Africa are now, 15 years after it ended, I think 15 is right, free of apartheid. But only on paper. There are still millions who live in squatters' camps, and I visited massive squatters' camps around both Johannesburg and Cape Town, and there are probably some around other cities I didn't see. These are makeshift camps. They're euphemistically called settlement, informal settlements, meaning you won't stay here forever. But so far they've been there for 15 years. People live in tin shacks that are literally no bigger than my kitchen in Evergreen. And this is families of 12, 15 people. Or they live in wooden houses made of slats with openings so big you can see inside, and the cold wind just whistles through. Whistles through. We went into a few, we were invited in, and in one of them, 90% of the floor space of the entire home that had 12 people was taken up by 2 single beds, side by side, pushed up against another, and they sleep, foot head, 12 people on 2 single beds, and there's almost nothing else in the house. There's no sanitation, there's no fresh water, there's no easily obtained electricity. They steal electricity and run lines, and it's awfully dangerous, and there are fires an awful lot of the time, and a lot of people die in those fires. But the end of apartheid was a triumph for South Africa, but it turns out to be a tragedy for some of these people. It died in daily practice, but not in daily life. There are a lot of problems there, despite all the great hopes. And it is indeed a better place than it used to be for the majority of the people. And it's a worse place, as a matter of fact, for what was the white minority. But that said, there's still, apartheid is a reality in education. There are schools in the poor black townships that are much better off than they were. More resources have been poured in, but the problem isn't money. The problem there, and in other places like it, is that there is no culture of education. There's no appreciation of education, because the parents today of the children who are in this lousy system, they got a minimal education for starters. And that education got them, was lousy, and it got them nowhere, because they still ended up being third-class citizens who could not even enter a city at night without a pass, and only worked at the lowest jobs, which was to take care of the highest people. Another problem is joblessness. There was a great hope that with political freedom would come prosperity. Prosperity would mean people who had jobs, and they had jobs that paid a fairly decent income. Well, when I was in one of the settlement camps, I told you about the tin shacks and the wooden houses, but we also came to some steel containers, the kind of thing you'd see on a ship, shipping containers. 2 families live in each container. 2 families live in each container. I went up to a woman who was standing on the mud, bending down over a bucket, washing her family's dirty clothes, and asked her, "How long have you lived here?" She said, "For years." And I said, "Do you think you'll ever get out?" She said, "Only if I can find a job." And I said, "Are you looking?" And she said, "For years." So when you talk about low expectations, that's not confined to the people in Russia. It's also true for many people in South Africa. I was looking for explanations. Why is it that a nation with great resources, with good intellect, and with high hopes can fall on these kinds of hard times? And among those I got to interview was a guy named Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a Nobel laureate, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who's a brilliant guy, nice guy. I interviewed him years before, a few times back when I used to go to South Africa during the Rhodesian Civil War. And he managed to stay out of jail when Nelson Mandela and plenty of others were put in jail fighting for equality. He managed to stay out and helped from the outside, which they needed, to usher in the end of apartheid. And when I asked him why they didn't fulfill the dreams they had, he laughed. He has a deep, he's very funny. He has a joyful laugh. And he said, and again I pasted it onto a page here, he said, "How naive we were, thinking that just because our struggle was noble and our motives were altruistic, we would govern without many of the flaws of the governments that preceded us. He said, what we have learned the hard way is corruption and selfishness and greed are not just products of people with white skin. We started our shoot in Soweto. We literally took 2 straight overnight flights. I'm only 38 years old, and look at the wrinkles and the gray hair. We took 2 straight overnight flights. We got off the planes and went straight to the huge cemetery in Soweto. For those of you who remember the name Soweto, S-O-W-E-T-O, that stands for Southwest Township. It wasn't worth naming the townships where the black majority lived. It was the Southwest Township. And so we went there because it was a Saturday that we landed, and Saturday's the day at the cemetery. Saturday's the day they bury people. They used to bury people who were victims of violence, and now primarily they bury people who are victims of AIDS. As a matter of fact, the place is so busy that it used to open on Saturdays, which was already the busy day, the only day people had. Used to open at 11 o'clock in the morning. It now opens at 8. And we got there, and it was like going to a county fair from a distance. As we're driving in, we had a driver meet us at the airport, Johannesburg, because there were thousands of people. And it turns out there might be 50 people around one coffin, and young men chanting, sometimes in native tongues, sometimes Christian hymns, tribal music, and at the same time shoveling dirt onto the coffin, and right next to them would be another group doing the same thing, and next to them another. I mean, I've seen a lot in my life. I can count myself very lucky. It's not lucky that these things are happening, but I'm lucky that I've gotten to see them firsthand. Never seen anything that came even close to that, not even in the aftermath of a war. I interviewed one man who was in his mid-30s. He was dying of AIDS, and at the end of the interview, he asked me for 200 rand, which is like 30 bucks. He said, it will keep me alive for another month. I gave him the 30 bucks because the government wasn't helping him. As a matter of fact, in those days, and this just 2 years ago, the Minister of Health had some hocus-pocus witchcraft answer about AIDS. So it's a remarkable place. And yet, I don't think a day went by that I didn't interview some black man or woman who didn't say that despite their poverty, despite their privations, despite their dashed hopes, that life wasn't better than it had been. And they're still living in poverty, and they haven't gotten the prosperity they wanted, but they also live in freedom. They also live in peace, by the way. You know, the world expected a civil war. The world expected, I remember one man used a phrase, this was many years ago when I was there, he said, he was a black man, the swimming pools of the white masters will run red with blood. It didn't happen. And I interviewed, amongst others, a guy who had, for a short time, been Mandela's cellmate. He told me the story. When Mandela and all the others worked every day, they went to a lime quarry on Robben Island off of Cape Town. They went to a lime quarry. They would excuse themselves. They'd ask for permission to go into a cave, and I saw the cave, which was down in the quarry, to urinate, maybe more. But in fact, they'd stay a little longer. The guards were hot and lazy, and they didn't really notice. This is where the beginning of the AMC was. And they would talk about the future and how they would deal with the country as its rulers. And of course, it was only a dream, probably to some seemed like a pipe dream, but that's what they talked about. So when they finally saw the unimaginable happen, and the political prisoners first were released, and then there were democratic elections, and Mandela became the president of the country, and they were in charge, there were those who agitated to punish the white man. And Mandela, who all of us probably have found things to admire about, but what I admire most is what I heard about him. He's the one who argued with others, and Abraham Lincoln did the same kind of thing, by the way, after the Civil War. He argued with others, let them go home. When we talked in that cave about equality for all men, we were thinking at the time black men, but in fact it meant all men. And so you can thank, and the people there can thank Nelson Mandela for the state of peace. They chose reconciliation over revenge. So, and there's a degree to which it's a happy story with a happy ending, but for millions and millions and millions of people, happiness is still just a dream. Pardon me. The Middle East. And you've got the former ambassador to Israel, Phil Wilcox, who I've interviewed in Israel. I think he's a good guy, coming, next month or something? And then the ambassador from Syria. So they're probably going to show you what a pack of lies this all is. But, I'm the guy who doesn't have a dog in the hunt. They do. So maybe there's some reality to what I'm going to say to you. I covered, back in the old days with ABC, two of the truly decisive events that created the equation that you might now call the Middle East. One was the Iranian Revolution, where they openly rejected Western values, which they would use a synonym, decadence. That was one. It's the first time that had actually happened out in the open in a massive national forum like that. And the other was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was truly a clash of two cultures. A semi-Western culture, that's the Soviets, and the culture of Afghanistan itself, the Mujahideen. And I've covered the Middle East. First time I went was 1977, and been there many, 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 many times. Most of those years that I wasn't home with Carol in Europe, I was in the Middle East, because a lot of things were happening in those days. And it made me a pessimist. People on all sides, I won't say two sides because there are so many sides in every one of the conflicts in the Middle East, but people on all sides are there to resist attempts to bring them together. Not just because they're holding out for something we're not offering yet. It's because they have truly different sets of values. And I won't even pass a value judgment on some of those sets of values. On others, it's obvious to all of us as Americans and Westerners, but they just have different values. Remember the metaphor of McDonald's. Even in that silly little way, they think a little differently than we do. In a bigger sense, think about suicide bombers. If you've struggled, as I have, and I probably know the place better than a lot of people, if you've struggled trying to understand how can suicide bombers do that, what would drive somebody to strap dynamite to their chest and blow themselves to smithereens, I think that's the wrong question. Because, all of us have some level of devotion to something. And so, if you feel strongly enough, if you think maybe it's going to help your family, or something, you're going to do it. We wouldn't do it, but you can begin to understand. So that's the wrong question. The question is, how can they go someplace and blow up sometimes dozens, in the case of 9/11, thousands of innocent people, men, women, and children? How could anybody do that? And the only explanation is we can't begin to figure out the answer to that question because we don't understand them. They have different cultural values, obviously different religious values, they have different historic values. And we just don't understand them. They don't represent, in my view, the majority of people, or even a large minority. But they're enough to make a lot of noise and intimidate everybody else. I've also heard, I think it's just fair to say, I've been in Gaza, it's a pretty radical place, and heard sermons saying, give peace a chance. I mean, not quite that benevolently, but that's been the message. And I've been in Israel, and have met plenty of people who have sought to build bridges with their Palestinian neighbors. But it doesn't take but a few radicals to, kind of create a mess. The most recent example that hammers that home in my experience was Lebanon, which I told you I visited toward the end of last year. First day I got there, once again, they whipsawed me right off an overnight flight, and we went to a refugee camp. That's really where you want to go when you've been flying for about 35 hours. A refugee camp in Beirut. And I've been in this one before. It's called Burj al-Barajneh. And it's a god-awful place. It occupies several acres, has a wall around it. People are free to come and go, although some of the Palestinians are treated by their benevolent Arab hosts in Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan and a few other places like trash. They aren't even given national citizenship papers. They can't go out and get a job. They can't get a driver's license. These are their hosts who talk the talk, but they don't really walk the walk. But anyway, we go into Burj al-Barajneh, where you have now 5 generations of Palestinians who call themselves refugees. And I'm going to generalize here, so don't hold this up against the official UN definition. But plenty of Palestinians, most Palestinians in the world, they live where they live, not in refugee camps. And whether or not they've accepted their fate is another question, but they've chosen to do the best they can do where they are. The people calling themselves refugees are holding on to that pipe dream that they will return to the homes that they say the Israelis, the Jews, took more than 60 years ago when Israel was created. And they cannot make that claim if ever that day comes, which it won't. They cannot make that claim unless they are officially, in the eyes of the UN, refugees. So they stay in these squalid refugee camps. That, by the way, if you read about the issues between Israel and the Palestinians, that's called right of return. They are fighting to have the right to return to the land that is now, and has for a long time been, Israel. In that camp, in the old days, when I've been in a lot of those camps, the flags, and you'd see flags flying everywhere, they were white, red, and green, the flags of the PLO. Today, they're yellow, the flags of Hezbollah. And what does that mean? Should be obvious. You know, the PLO, they weren't a bunch of good guys either, but they got to the point where ultimately, at least they sat down with the Israelis they had once condemned. As a matter of fact, they continued to condemn them, but they sat with them. Hezbollah, the very word means resistance. Some form of the word resistance in our language. And that is, to this day, their charter and their mandate, to resist any accommodation with Israel. Mind you, there are Israelis who resist any accommodation with Palestinians. It's a two-way street. But, you know, Hezbollah thrives on division, and there are divisions in the Palestinian community. Should we try to make peace and at least get a land we can call our own, or should we hold out for the right of return? And the situation's far too complex for this generality or this simplification, but that's at the root of the struggle in the Middle East today. So there we are in Beirut, and after the, you might find this interesting. I wanted to go down to the border, South Lebanon. And I also wanted to do some shooting. I shouldn't use the word shooting when you're talking Beirut. We want to do some videotaping in South Beirut, which is a very tough place, very hard place, and a very dangerous place. To do that, the credentials that we got that are required from the Lebanese government were like toilet paper. The credentials we also got from the Lebanese army, separate bureaucracy, were like toilet paper. We had to go get credentials from Hezbollah. They control everything in South Beirut and most of South Lebanon. There's nobody in uniform in South Beirut. You won't see a uniform, even directing traffic. You know, the government forces who are, you know, supposed to be everywhere in the world, supposed to be there to protect us, even in traffic, aren't. They won't go there. And so the people directing traffic, holding a walkie-talkie in one hand and a baton in the other, are Hezbollah. They're paid by Hezbollah. You say to yourself, where does Hezbollah get that money? And everybody's read it's somewhere between speculation and known fact that they get it primarily from Iran and some from Syria, probably some also from our partners in places like Saudi Arabia. But when you walk around South Beirut, I asked to do some videotaping, and we were given a couple of minders. But we did it. There's sky cranes everywhere. You may remember that in 2006, Israel and Hezbollah fought a hot little war. You know, Israel and Hamas, Gaza, that's sort of southern Israel. This is northern Israel. Israel gets to play on both sides of the playground. And they fought this hot little war, and Israel bombed the daylights out of a lot of South Beirut, which had sort of 10, 12-story concrete apartment blocks that housed thousands of people. And so they were turned to rubble, and there's still a lot of rubble there, but there's also a lot of reconstruction and sky cranes. Hezbollah's in a very poor part of town. So that helps to verify the speculation, I should say, that money's coming in from outside. So what should the United States do? We can't solve things. We don't understand these people. I don't care whether you've got a Democrat or a Republican in the White House or in the State Department. We can't offer them something that would appeal to us if we were in their position, because we don't know what appeals to them. Because unlike us, you know, what do we want? Well, these days we want our retirement portfolios to rise again. Some of us may want a boat. A lot of us probably want newer, better skis. In some parts of the world, people just want to know that there will be a meal on the table tomorrow, and that there will be a roof over their heads, and their greatest aspiration is that their children will live a better life than they lived. In that part of the world, there are people, not all, but people who want more than anything else to destroy their enemy, and to achieve their unrealistic goals. So I don't think we can appeal to them. What we can do is maintain a coalition-like relationship with the more moderate Arab countries or Islamic countries and leaders who might moderate the money that goes to support the groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm not a big believer in the prospect of diplomacy, and I hope and pray that I'm proved wrong very soon, but I'm not. So, happy ending? Not yet. I do want to leave time for questions. I just want to tell you quickly about Vietnam, because this is something, at this program World Report that I work for on HDNet television, we try to do things that other people aren't doing. So, I'm cutting a piece about the Russian space program. Is it dangerous for us to rely on them when the shuttle stops flying in a year and a half to get our astronauts and our European and Canadian and Japanese partners up to the space station? Could there be a political rift? Could there be an economic tailspin in Russia that puts our $100 billion investment at risk? Vietnam, we went to do a program about Agent Orange. Now, most of you in this room are old enough to remember Agent Orange. We sprayed it on the jungles to defoliate the trees so that we could see the enemy, primarily Viet Cong, some North Vietnamese army, sneaking south. They used the trees as cover. We wanted to deny them the cover. But Agent Orange was to defoliate the trees, and it was sprayed from American aircraft, sometimes sprayed by hand as well, but mainly from large American aircraft, also from helicopters. And it has created, at this point, a third generation, I'm going to say apparently, has created at this point a third generation of children with severe, grotesque birth defects, which with much higher rates of cancer in the areas, and again, the children being born in areas either near the 3 major air bases that we used, where it got into groundwater, because we did not know what it was, what it did. We knew Agent Orange, which is not orange, by the way, it's a white powder, but the barrels were color-coded orange. Agent Orange basically comes down to dioxin, and dioxin is one of the most toxic chemical compounds known to man. And so it gets into the groundwater, gets into the soil, and I'm not a chemist. I damn near flunked out of college because of chemistry. But if you think of asbestos, and there's no other parallel, but asbestos in its physical form has hooks and stays because it's hard to eradicate. Dioxin evidently is the same, so it got into groundwater, got into soil, got into people's bodies, and stayed. The Vietnamese say that there are some 3 million people in their nation of, I think it's 80 or 85 million, who are victims of Agent Orange poisoning. We also have American servicemen, the ones who handle the stuff, who have been crippled and struck with high rates of cancer. There have been lawsuits and all the rest, but it's nasty stuff. And yet, remarkably, and some of you, who here has been to Vietnam? I know a lot of tourists go there, and a lot of people go there to do good works from this country. You don't sense bitterness. You don't sense bitterness. In Hanoi, I interviewed 2 men in their 70s who were veterans of the war. Both of them are severely crippled, have no energy. One of them has a daughter who's 33 who he described to me in translation as abnormal. She was born that way. And he blames Agent Orange. He told me a story. He was with the North Vietnamese army, and they were going south, and there was an American aircraft overhead. And it sprayed this white powder. He said, I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. He said he ran for 4 hours to get away from it. Well, he didn't get away from it. Apparently didn't get away from it. And yet, at the end of my interview with these 2 guys, they warmly welcomed me and invited me to come back and see them, to have dinner in their homes. Cameraman and I were walking, there were just 2 of us on this trip, walking through a marketplace in Da Nang. It was pouring down rain. It was monsoon season. It was always pouring down rain. And there were, television camera, you can't really hide. So people saw us, and they were all smiling. We're Americans, it was obvious. And 3 guys, and there was not a full set of teeth between them, called me over and motioned, we want to take your picture with us. And so I told the cameraman, Paul, and he shot it. And one of the guys, laughingly, they put their arm, we got our arms around each other, and he put a V for victory sign in front of my chest, and we all had a good laugh. I mean, it may not strike you as amazing because it's 35 years since we stopped fighting that war, until you think about China and Korea, where you will find deep resentment more than 60 years after World War II against Japan for its behavior back in those days. So it was pretty amazing, but it wasn't a happy story, and it doesn't have a happy ending either. We went to a hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, to the former Saigon, and there's a children's ward. And even though I think they calculate that 12% of the people in Vietnam back during the war were somehow exposed to Agent Orange, 60-some% of the kids in that children's ward, and there were like 100 kids, are from the hot spots, the areas where Agent Orange was concentrated. And, I mean, terrible, kids with no arms, just legs, kids with no legs, just arms, one little girl with legs growing out of her tummy, hydrocephalus. One girl was lying there, looked dead because her head is as wide as her shoulders and she can't lift it. One little girl, 6 years old, has no eyes. No eyes. So the whole time we were there, she was doing this with her right hand, which has no fingers, like this. Something's bothering her inside. Now, do we know that this is the consequence of Agent Orange? No. The statistics suggest it. And in my opinion, common sense. Well, I went to Washington afterwards, interviewed a guy named Walter Isaacson. He used to run Time Magazine, then CNN. He's now in charge of the Aspen Institute, which, of course, has a big presence in Aspen, but their headquarters are in Washington. And what he said made sense. He said, the reason the United States hasn't really owned up, and we haven't owned up to it, is because of potential legal issues and questions of legal and moral responsibility. He said, let's just scrub that. Let's just give Vietnam some money for humanitarian purposes, because any moron can see the connection, cause and effect. And I like to think I'm even more than a moron, and it seems pretty obvious to me. The United States has stepped up, in a small way. It has stepped up. Congress last year, 2008, appropriated $3 million for both humanitarian purposes and to mitigate some of the water problems right around the airbase in Da Nang. There's a lake called Lotus Lake. We hiked to it. I wanted to burn my shoes afterwards. Until 2 years ago, when tests showed a heavy presence of dioxin in Lotus Lake, people were going there to fish. So you ask, how does it get into a third generation? That's how. Multiply that by the number of hotspots they've got in that country. I talked to the U.S. ambassador. Our embassy is in Hanoi. And he's a great guy, in my opinion. Michael Mahalik is his name. And he said, we're doing what we can. I've got certain constraints, he said, but we recognize the problem. And we're doing what we can. We're encouraging private foundations and so forth to do it. So that's kind of a happy ending, but it could go into a fourth generation. I'll tell you a quick final anecdote and open it to questions if you have any. In Da Nang, which is the airbase from which we operated most frequently with flights heading out to spray Agent Orange, we met a woman. She's in her mid-30s. She was born with a mangled leg, and now she's also dying of cancer. Her husband left her a long time ago. She's got a, 13-year-old daughter, I think it is. And when I'm interviewing them through a translator, the daughter's crying and the mother's crying, saying, what's going to happen to my daughter when I'm gone? It's all very sad. She learned 2 years ago when these tests, she's quite close to this Lotus Lake, when tests showed that dioxin was heavy in that area. And she has a well in back, by the way, a little plot of dirt behind the house. It's a house in which she was born, in which her parents were born. It's a little bitty place. And there's a well in back, and that was their only source of water. But, put it together, they're that close, literally 1,000 feet from the edge of the airbase. You can figure it out. So 2 years ago, she and everyone else in the neighborhood were told, get bottled water, we'll subsidize the cost of it. This is a woman who had to quit when she got cancer, had to quit a job where she used to earn $9 a week. Now she doesn't even get that. But they subsidize, she gets bottled water. And so she, after the interview, she led me back to her kitchen. She was going to prepare lunch for her daughter and her, and she had some greens, I don't know what they were. And she took a pot, metal pot, and held it under the vat of bottled water. And she filled the pot. She put it on top of the stove, propane stove, and turned it on. And then she took the greens and put them in a sieve, walked out to the back of the house, and dipped them in the well. So there's more than just American money, there's more than just American medical care, there's education, which until now is not producing, to wrap it all up, a happy ending. Thank you for all your attention, and if you have any questions, shoot. Yes.
Greg, I'm sure you saw in South Africa a dilemma with which we deal here, which is what we all call illegal immigrants or undocumented workers. And I'm curious, is that a phenomenon everywhere in the world, in all these places you've been, or are we in South Africa unusual in that aspect?
And you, Mike and Ann Moore, have spent a lot of time in Africa. We were in the Peace Corps back in the Woodrow Wilson years.
It was before you were born.
Yeah. The question, because you don't have the microphone, is illegal immigration, and they've seen it in South Africa, and it's there big time. It's people from much poorer, black African nations going there for jobs and for infrastructure, and sometimes from war-torn nations. And do I see that elsewhere? The answer is yes. Everywhere is the word you used, and I don't know that it's everywhere, but you see it in Russia. There's now illegal immigration in Russia. I went to Bolivia a couple of years ago when Evo Morales became the new president, the first indigenous president. And they have illegal immigration there. Bolivia is one of the poorest countries. It's landlocked and everything else. And they have people sneaking in trying to get jobs because they've got natural gas there. And so, people have this impression that, prosperity will follow the journey. So, yeah, I mean, I see it. It's treated different ways. It's treated with utter violence in South Africa. And again, I don't claim to be an expert. I didn't bring it up because I don't know enough about it, but I was told a bit about it. And frankly, we spent Carol, it was a perfectly good car, roaming through one of the areas where all these people are, shooting video from the car, but ready to speed away if we got attacked, because people get attacked all the time because these people come and they have no work and they have no money and they're desperate and they can't go home. They don't even have bus fare. Imagine not having bus fare. We may not be able to fly first class. They can't get on a bus. Anybody else? I should go to different. Oh, there's nobody over there. Okay. How about yes? No. Male, female, male, female. Yes.
You talked about hoping that diplomacy works in the Middle East, but you're not hopeful. What is your opinion of the solution with where we are in our country today, and the fear and terrorism and that type of thing? How do we come to a peaceful conclusion or a place for the United States?
Basically, how do we come to a peaceful place in this country with respect to terrorism, and based on what I said about having little confidence in the power of diplomacy in the radical parts of the Middle East? If you use the word solution, that is my answer. I wouldn't say there's a solution. I'd say there's an accommodation. There's an accommodation. Israel and the Palestinians, for example, from the Israeli point of view, the accommodation is the wall. Most of you probably are aware that there's a great big concrete wall that cuts not in a straight line, but generally along the border between Israel proper today and the West Bank. And until they have confidence that they will not be attacked, in marketplaces and so forth, they're going to keep up that wall. So in this country, politically, I was not a fan of George W. Bush, and I disagreed with him, and Cheney just said it the other day, actually, that it is because of all their policies that we've been safe from attack. But I think it is because of some of their policies. And this, again, I'm getting out of my league when I talk about it, but you asked, and I have the microphone. We are safe because a lot of plots, to simplify it, are nipped in the bud that none of us ever hears about. I do hear about them indirectly. I have heard about them, I should say, indirectly, because I spent a lot of time in Washington. But by and large, it's not because we fought over there. If anything, that probably increased the number of people who want to attack us. Then you can look at it from the other side. It only took 19 men to get on those 4 airplanes in September of 2001, with a few more to help them. But I can't answer your question. I can only tell you that the courses we have taken have not worked. And they have not worked because, in my opinion, American foreign policy has always been based on the Western view of what would appeal, as I said earlier, to the people on the other side in any negotiation, and that doesn't work. We've got to say to ourselves, what is it that they want, not what is it that we would want if we were them. Next.
Okay.
You actually had your hand up first. Back there, yeah, please.
Yeah, when I was at the War Crime Museum in Hanoi, I believe we killed 2 million Vietnamese.
The figure generally is put at 2 million Vietnamese who died during the war.
And you'd asked, Time Magazine did a thing of, there was a Palestinian girl, college graduate, she blew herself up. And if you look at the map in 1948 and what it is now, I don't blame them. I mean, they don't have a Navy, an Army. Israel gets $10 million a day. A month ago, 60 Minutes said that Israel increases 5% each year with their colonies. I mean, I don't believe in killing innocent people, but aren't they driven to desperation? If I were to move into your house, wouldn't she get mad at me?
The question generally, you probably can't hear back there, can you? No. Am I correct? Yeah. Wasn't really a question, but I'm going to try to summarize it.
No, why do they get mad? Israel's taking 5%.
Yeah, in a way, is it hard to understand why the people who blow themselves up, who conduct acts of terrorism, is hard to understand when you see what he's citing, which is Israel encroaching on their land. That means West Bank settlements, which, by the way, both sides believe they have a biblical claim to the land. So is it hard to understand? They're desperate. They have less to live for. Their lives, I mean, it is true. I mean, their lives are not nearly as sweet, and we're not even in the same league in our lifestyles. But, they don't have as much to lose, but what they lose is the fundamental that we would lose if we were conducting those acts. They lose their family, and they lose their future. So one could argue that no matter how desperate you are, you're giving up a lot. I was going to tell you this. I was in Gaza, I guess that was 2 or 3 years ago maybe. You may remember it was when Sharon was the Prime Minister of Israel, and he forced Jewish settlers out of some settlements that had been there for a long, long time, right up against the sort of southwest border of Gaza. And these people were nutty. Take it from me. Nutty, number one, to live next to enemies. This is not like a Democrat living next to a Republican. These are people who want to kill each other. And yet they wanted to live there because it was the way they could stake their claim to the land that the Bible, they believe, says is theirs. And their bile, when I was there, is when they were moving out, was not for the Arabs. It was for Sharon and the comparative moderates in Israel. But again, basically what I said earlier in the talk was, if I try to tell you I understand these people, kick me out. So I can't explain why they blow themselves up. I can only say the one thing I know is I don't understand them, and therefore I shouldn't even try. Male? There's a female over there, trying to be perfectly fair.
I think you've done some investigating and some writing on the immigration issue, and I wondered what your thoughts are on how that should be resolved.
I haven't done any investigating. I have done some surface coverage, so I'm not going to answer your question. Really, I don't understand how it should be solved. I mean, each of us could lay out the range of potential solutions, none of which is really a solution, from kicking everybody out and saying Americans can do these jobs and will as long as there aren't people willing to take less money, breaking our laws, costing us money, to invite them all in, everyone who wants to come, because it's a great global world, and it's just we're not Americans because we're smarter than they are, we're just luckier than they are because we were born here. So, and then most of the practical potential solutions fall in between. I mean, I will tell you this, I believe in a guest worker program. I believe, now I'm not going to tell you what I believe because it's just my instinct. It's not because I'm a reporter and I know more than anybody else, so it's not worth hearing. Yes.
2 more questions. Just 2 more.
Sorry?
2 more questions.
2 more questions. Okay, you, and then you had your hand. Go ahead.
Greg, in your opinion, did we win or lose the war in Iraq?
In my opinion, did we? Oh boy, that's a tough question. Didn't you say that was the last question before? In my opinion, we won and we lost. And I'm not trying to be cute. We obviously got rid of Saddam Hussein. Now back, you take a look at the first year of the run-up to the war, which the war began in March 2003, so a little over we're in March, so 6 years ago exactly. In fact, what was the date? Anybody remember? Huh?
I think it was today, wasn't
Right around now. Yeah. Yeah. Same time as the blizzard of the century. Right? Remember? Here. But anyway, I mean, we won because we achieved some of the objectives and we brought them a semblance of democracy. But remember what I said about democracy in Russia. So apply that also to democracy in Iraq. And as long as we understand that democracy doesn't just mean being able to vote, select your leaders, but it also means having the freedom to speak openly without having to look over your shoulder and worrying that you're going to lose your job and maybe your life, then it's a good thing, and to that degree we won. The gray area between won and lost, in my opinion, is that we certainly haven't quelled the hate between different ethnic and religious groups there. Nobody can predict whether it will blow up again once and if we leave. I should say once we leave, because we're going to. It might not. I mean, take a look at the former Yugoslavia. Take a look at Northern Ireland, where just the other day, or I should say in the last few days, there have been 2 different violent acts. Everybody thought it was kind of over. I used to cover Northern Ireland back in the late 70s, early 80s. I heard vile speech by Protestants against Catholics and Catholics against Protestants, and frankly, in one of the many predictions that I've been wrong about, said they'll never get together. They have gotten together, and that's good news. But there are still those who are trying to retard the process because they probably learned to hate people from the other side before they learned the alphabet. We lost because we created a lot of animosity that wasn't there before. Everywhere I've been, I used to cover Libya back when we had our troubles with Gaddafi. You know, I mean, there was a time when Libya was about the most vile political country on earth from the standpoint of the United States. The Libyan people were the sweetest people on earth. And they loved Americans, and they loved our culture. They didn't consider us decadent the way the Iranians did. And so people who once admired a lot about us now, in my opinion, well, it's more than my opinion, you can read it anywhere, now resent the fact that we came in so heavy-handed. And furthermore, by the way, I do not believe that by fighting them over there, we don't have to fight them over here. As I said before, I think there are other reasons why we're not fighting them over here. So, I'm rambling. Anne, last question.
Are there any chemicals being developed to neutralize the effects of dioxin?
Are there chemicals being developed to neutralize the effects of dioxin? Yes. But it's not finished. And they're doing it, they're working on it, as they never have before, and that's motivated in part by the problems there. There are a couple of organizations in this country. I mentioned the Ford Foundation's played a leading role in trying to establish scientific procedures to, you can seal off waterways that have been contaminated, but the water is still contaminated. The next step is to actually get the dioxin out of it, because that water is going to go into the ground and it's going to come up somewhere else. Parenthetically, just to make you feel lucky that you're Americans, born where you live, I mentioned Indonesia. The story we did in Indonesia, the program, everything I get to do is more than just a short story, was about the fact that roughly half the people in the world's 4th most populous country, we're 3rd, they're 4th, Russia's 5th, don't have access to clean water. When I say dirty water, I don't just mean sort of, a bad day at home. I'm talking about sewage. And I mean, I saw people pulling up buckets of sewage and taking it into their homes. I saw a kid, actually we saw 2 different places, jumping in and out of the water doing backflips like it was a swimming pool in Beverly Hills. This is how some people live, and they have no way out. Their governments are either corrupt or just inept. But as a result, they are stuck with what they're born with. We're born with opportunity. And for the most part, we seize it. People in the Middle East are born with conflict. They're born with enemies, who want to kill them before they, leave the maternity ward. So we're pretty lucky. And thank you again for all your attention. I hope I didn't keep you too long.